Hello, and welcome to Martial March, the review series where I attempt to review 31 martial arts movies. Alright, let's go ahead and address that. You're probably wondering why I'm uploading this in May and not in March, in keeping with the actual title of the series. Well, if you've been following me on my SoundCloud, you would know that I actually did start the series proper in March as a series of audio-only reviews. However, since nobody really was listening to them, I figured, okay, well, I should at least put together a YouTube version. However, between balancing my day job, a global pandemic, and a literal freaking earthquake striking the state where I live within the same 2-week time frame, suffice it to say, March was not a very good month for a lot of people. But in spite of this, I soldiered on and managed to produce all 31 episodes of the audio reviews, which are now readily available on my SoundCloud, soundcloud.com/StudioGhostUtah, and then spent the latter half of April and the first week of May putting together the video that you are watching right now. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Why am I putting all of these reviews in one video instead of breaking them apart like the viewer poll said I should? Well, given YouTube's general antagonism towards its user base as of late, I decided to implement what I like to call the Jim Sterling method. Because if I can't make money off of my hard work, no one can. But this is not the place to gripe about YouTube's utter failures as a content platform, especially if you're watching this on Facebook. This is a place where we are discussing martial arts cinema. And so, in keeping with that tradition, I felt it was appropriate to pick up from where I left off last year. Due to the numerous production problems that occurred with Ong-Bak 2, the people making the film had to split it into 2 parts, essentially creating a 2-part prequel to the original Ong-Bak. Ong-Bak 3 picks up right where the previous film leaves off, as Tien is tortured relentlessly as ordered by the commander that he tried to assassinate. The other outlaws attempt to rescue him, but are killed by Demon Crow, whom we saw briefly in the last film, but is given a much larger role here, as he becomes more or less the main villain of the film. His name is never actually said in the film. I had to learn it by watching the special features on the Blu-ray release. Anyway, as Tien is ordered to be executed, a royal decree from the king of Ayutthaya saves him in the nick of time, leading to Tien being taken to a nearby village to undergo treatment for his injuries. From here, the story focuses more on spirituality and philosophy, something only alluded to in the previous film, as the villagers pull together to try to disperse the negative karma that impedes Tien's recovery, leading to the creation of the statue of Ong-Bak, just to remind you that this is supposed to be a prequel. From there, we follow Tien's recovery as he works to heal his body and mind through the power of dance. Yes, you heard that right. But to the film's credit, it is using traditional Thai dance moves and finds a way to make it work within the context of the story. It's almost as if all the story and character development that was missing from Ong-Bak 2 was hiding here the whole time. As such, it actually provides an emotional context to the fights that follow and gives you a story that you can actually understand. Until the second half happens, where we are left with even more questions. The film leans hard into the mystical, as we now have a villain with superpowers, as well as exploring the notions of curses and gods, almost like a religious story. It doesn't help that we have an entire action sequence written off as a kinda sort of dream sequence. Either that or Tien gained the ability to time travel somehow. So the story is confusing, but what about the action, I hear you ask? Well, I do like the action in this film a bit better, especially when compared to Ong-Bak 2, as the film does a better job of characterizing the action and giving you a reason to actually care about the fighting. The implementation of traditional Thai dancing into combat is a creative way to demonstrate the internal-external dichotomy that you usually see in Chinese martial arts, while giving it a uniquely Thai flavor. As such, it actually shows us more of Tien's character, particularly after the changes he has undergone. Even in the fake-out fight scene, we see these elements blended together in a way that looks pretty cool. Looking at this film side by side with Ong-Bak 2, I think I understand what Tony Jaa was going for with these films. It's effectively a love letter to Thai culture that was created with the intention of introducing that culture to the rest of the world, and to bring it to the same level of ubiquity that Chinese and Japanese culture have in the public consciousness. It shows that he was really putting a lot of himself into this film, which explains why the stress of show business ultimately got to him and led him to become a Buddhist monk. Yes, that actually happened. Look it up. As a whole, while I did enjoy this film more than the previous one, it couldn't escape the unfortunate ripple effect that Ong-Bak 2 causes. The change of villains feels almost like an attempt to fix the story, but it ultimately just makes things more confusing. I'm willing to attribute my enjoyment of this film to the fact that the previous film annoyed me so much. As such, if you're going to watch Ong-Bak 2 and 3, make sure you watch them back to back, because then at least you're getting the full story. As confusing as it is. Well, either that or just stick with the first one, which is really where they should have stopped. The one positive from the two films is that it does make me want to look into the history and culture of Thailand beyond the cuisine and Muay, so mission accomplished, I guess. I know that this might not count as a martial arts film per se, but I needed a bit of a palate cleanser after Ong-Bak 3. Shaolin Wheel of Life was a stage show that was produced back in 1999 by Steve Nolan that sought to do for Chinese martial arts what Michael Flatley did for Irish step dancing. It was then recorded and edited under the direction of Nick Morris. The main draw of the show was that the show was officially sanctioned by the Shaolin Temple and featured real Shaolin monks demonstrating their martial prowess. As presented on this DVD, the film version is equal parts documentary and staged performance, intercutting the show itself with bits of B-roll, likely staged, that was recorded on location in Hunan. The show tells the story of the Shaolin monks, who demonstrate their skills for the Tang Emperor, help repel an invasion, but then are subsequently betrayed and murdered when they refuse the Emperor's offer to act as his personal guard, leaving only 5 monks to rebuild the monastery. If it sounds like I just summarized the entire story, I did. However, the story, what little there is, comprises the first half of the show, with the second half merely being a showcase of the monks' feats of strength and dexterity. That said, you're not going into this expecting a deep and engaging story, since stage shows like this are more about spectacle, with story just being a means of stringing together different demonstrations of strength and agility. The story segments, by that I mean the segments acted out in pantomime by actors, are somewhat engaging. I almost wish they gave you the opportunity of turning off the narration in order to appreciate them. I also wish they had spread the story throughout the entirety of the show, because as it is shown on this DVD, it feels like the story just stops at the halfway point, but rather than have a show that only runs 45 minutes, they felt the need to pad out the last 30 minutes with the more impressive feats of the Shaolin. As for the action, it's impressive, but not particularly memorable, at least as it's shown here. It doesn't help that they throw in a bunch of close-ups and shaky cam to make it feel more lively, rather than pulling the camera back and allowing us to appreciate the timing and acrobatics on display. With that in mind, what we're seeing here isn't all that different from what people see in countless demonstrations put on by the temple itself for tourists. Yeah, it's cool and shows great skill, but there's no emotional content to root it. You'd accomplish the same effect by watching a bunch of wushu demos on YouTube while listening to an audiobook about the history of the Shaolin Temple. I'm sure this is something that probably looked a lot cooler live, but as it's presented on the DVD, I could take or leave it. If you've got kids that are interested in Kung Fu, then this would probably be something that they would enjoy. However, being the jaded adult that I am, this one didn't really stick with me. I wouldn't recommend seeking out the DVD, but if you happen to find it used for like $5 or so like I did, and you're looking to kill 82 minutes, then knock yourself out. Chances are, if you are a fan of the Wu-Tang Clan, you have probably already seen or at least heard of this film. Continuing along the thread of Shaolin, today we are looking at one of the quintessential classics of the martial arts movie genre. This also marks the first time that we're looking at a film produced by Shaw Brothers. Directed by Liu Chia-liang, the 36th Chamber of Shaolin tells the story of Liu Yu-de, played by Liu Chia-hui, better known as Gordon Liu. He plays the son of a dried seafood seller who finds his city under the oppression of the Manchu government. He joins a resistance movement under the guidance of his school teacher, only for said efforts to be discovered by the presiding general. As he and his classmates attempt to scatter, suffering grievous wounds in the process, Yu-de journeys to the famous Shaolin Temple in order to learn Kung Fu. We then follow his journey as a monk with the new name San De, as he goes through each chamber of the Shaolin in order to hone his mind and body before enacting his revenge on the Manchu general who killed his teacher and his father. The story structure of this film feels a bit disjointed, as it takes a good 30 minutes or so before we learn who our main character is, as the film opens with an attempted assassination, followed by a fight scene and then the assassin's execution. It's only until Yu-de gets to the temple do we actually see the story start to pick up. From there, it follows a basic pattern. Yu-de enters the chamber, learns the obstacle or challenge he has to overcome, slowly overcomes it, and then moves on to the next chamber. Rinse and repeat for about 50 or so minutes. I wouldn't be as miffed if the transition to the third act of the story didn't feel so jarring, not helped by some questionable editing decisions. The film doesn't really end so much as come to an abrupt halt because they ran out of story. That said, given how Shaw Brothers operated as a studio, I'm willing to bet that the editors putting the film together were overworked from having to cut together 3 or so other films within the same day. So the story has pacing issues by modern standards, but what about the fighting? Well, this film makes use of traditional Chinese opera-inspired choreography where the fights have a clear back-and-forth rhythm to them. While it may seem a bit stiff, this film is definitely one of the better examples of this kind of choreography. It doesn't really make any attempt at realism and instead chooses to embrace the theatricality and the spectacle of the whole thing. As such, this film puts more emphasis on the characterization rather than just technique. and this is seen most notably during the later parts of the film as Sande works to problem solve during one of his encounters. Overall, it's easy to see why this film garnered as much attention as it did. It's aged surprisingly well, as it features well choreographed action scenes and a story that, while haphazard in its execution, actually happens to have a fair bit of nuance and depth to it. While some of the details could have been handled a little bit better, I still found it to be an entertaining film and a definite must-watch for any martial arts movie fan. I figured since I mentioned the Wu-Tang Clan in my previous review, it was only fitting that I follow that thread when deciding the next film. Directed by Reza, with choreography by Corey Yuen, The Man with the Iron Fist is effectively a love letter to kung fu movies from the abbot of the Wu-Tang Clan. Longtime viewers of my YouTube channel may remember that I reviewed this film when it first came out in theaters, and fans of the Wu-Tang Clan who see that review will likely want to throttle me for pronouncing the name as RZA in the review instead of Reza. In my defense, I didn't know anything about hip-hop, let alone who the Wu-Tang Clan were back then. Presently, my knowledge of hip-hop is more or less limited to Hamilton and the movie Straight Outta Compton, so take that for what it's worth. Anyway, since I reviewed it in theaters, for this analysis I'm taking a look at the unrated extended cut that was released on Blu-ray, a decision I somewhat regret, for reasons I will get into later. Making his directorial debut, Reza stars in the film as a blacksmith in Jungle Village, a village where numerous feuding clans vie for power and control, with the blacksmith being the go-to guy for their weapons, which he forges in the hope of eventually buying the freedom of his lover, Lady Silk, played by Jamie Chung, who works at a brothel run by Madame Blossom, played by Lucy Liu. When word gets out that a shipment of gold will be passing through the village, the various clans and even outside forces descend upon Jungle Village in a bid to claim the gold for themselves. This film features other prominent actors such as Russell Crowe, Rick Yune, Kung Lei, Dave Bautista, and Daniel Wu, to name a few. As for the story, it works for the most part, but suffers from a few issues regarding the way it's structured. For the most part, Reza's character serves as the narrator, but there are a few scenes here and there that don't really add anything to the story as a whole. I'm willing to attribute those scenes as being part of the extended cut since they stick out like sore thumbs, while the rest of the film has a solid flow to it. One part that bugged me was the language, and no, I don't mean the swearing, I'm talking about the languages spoken. There are moments throughout the film where we hear characters speaking Mandarin and then English, but then there are parts of the film where everyone is speaking English and able to understand each other. And I'm not talking just the characters that are supposed to be native to Jungle Village, I'm talking specifically about exchanges between characters like the blacksmith and the Shaolin monks, as well as Jack's introductory scene at the brothel. It's annoyingly inconsistent, and the language barrier doesn't affect the plot in any meaningful way, since it's established that Jack, the blacksmith, and Brass Body, played by Bautista, have no difficulty communicating with the people of Jungle Village. Again, this comes up in the extended cut, as I don't remember this being an issue when watching the theatrical version. Those detractions aside, the film is structured in a more episodic format, much like the martial arts films of yore, with a fair bit of intrigue and a few twists and turns to keep things interesting. It's peppered with a number of flourishes and homages to past films, but you don't need to be an avid scholar to appreciate the film for what it is. It does, however, suffer from what Red Letter Media calls the ending multiplication effect, as the final climactic battle is split across three fronts. As for the overall style, I would describe it as Tarantino meets hip-hop, as it doubles down on the gore and brutality while also having a few moments that are shot as though they were part of a music video. Unfortunately, this results in some moments where we don't really get to appreciate the action scenes due to some quick cuts and CGI that has not aged well. That said, the film is colorful, with each location having a unique aesthetic that makes the film pop. Speaking of which, the action is pretty solid, but mostly standard fare for modern action movies. There are some scenes that feature a few cool visual motifs, but I wouldn't consider the fights particularly memorable from either a blocking or a cinematography standpoint. It does at least have the sense to make it clear who is who with unique costume design and set motifs, more than what can be said for some of the film's contemporaries. While it's easy to write this film off as Reza's vanity project, for a directorial debut, he did a pretty good job here. Do the final moments feel a bit self-indulgent? Kinda, but at least it feels earned. The character doesn't start as an active participant until he's pulled into the conflict, so given the groundwork and context, it works. Overall, there's a lot about this film that works, and it's a nice send-up to the very films that inspired Reza and the Wu-Tang Clan. You can tell that there was a real passion behind the project. It doesn't try to be more than what it is, nor does it try to stroke the ego of its director. It's just a fun, over-the-top, grindhouse kung fu flick. That said, if you do wish to watch it, stick with the theatrical version. The added scenes in the extended cut do more harm than good, and the only real difference is that the ending sets things up for the straight-to-video sequel that nobody really watched. Lastly, stick with the DVD or streaming, because the Blu-ray for this film is one of the most obnoxious Blu-rays I have ever had to deal with. This came out when the format was new, so it has a bunch of annoying gimmicks that will drive you insane. Today, we're jumping from hip-hop to Motown as we travel back to the 80s for today's review. Directed by Michael Schultz, Barry Gordy's The Last Dragon is a tongue-in-cheek parody of martial arts cinema in the style of films like Young Frankenstein or Airplane, and kind of is almost a precursor to films like Black Dynamite. Why is it called Barry Gordy's The Last Dragon? Well, because he's the executive producer. It's as simple as that. Anyway, the film stars Taimak as Leroy Green, a martial artist on a quest to master the mysterious force known as the Glow. After being dismissed by his martial arts teacher upon mastering his techniques, Leroy goes on a journey to find a master who has obtained the Glow to complete his training. Along the way, he runs afoul of the self-proclaimed Shogun of Harlem, Sho'nuff, played by Julius J. Carey III, and an obsessed record promoter named Eddie Arcadian, played by Christopher Murney, who seeks to kidnap the singer/video DJ Laura Charles, played by Prince's protege Vanity. In terms of the kind of humor the film uses, it's not one of those that relies on direct pop culture references like we see in a lot of comedies today. Instead, it uses audience expectation and a knowledge of tropes as the source of its comedy. And what helps is that there's almost this internal disconnect between the events of the story and the world at large, as the over-the-top nature of both Leroy and Sho'nuff is contrasted with the reactions of regular people who regard them as crazy and out of touch. It's almost like everything that's happening is just taking place in this own little world of delusion, while the rest of society tries its best to ignore it. This helps keep the film grounded and is helped greatly by Taimak's performance as Leroy, who, while an accomplished martial artist in his own right, is a complete dork in all other aspects of his life, and it makes it work. Despite it being a comedy, the film also features some really entertaining fight scenes, but they're just played more for comedy rather than coolness. That said, the final battle between Sho'nuff and Leroy is amazing to watch, both for the choreography and also the final payoff where we finally see the Glow in all of its glory. Hell, even when Leroy is fighting some of Arcadian's goons, you see really good fight scenes that are on par with what we see in Jackie Chan's movies. Overall, this is one of the best American martial arts comedies I've ever seen. This is almost like what you would get if Mel Brooks decided to produce a martial arts film with actual martial artists and not people pretending to be martial artists. A good comparison is that this is almost kind of on the same level of films like Two Guns, where it's just a fun, entertaining action comedy that doesn't rely on the cultural zeitgeist for its humor. If you want a comedy that both makes you laugh and looks frickin' awesome, then check this film out when you get the chance. Today, we're looking at a different type of martial arts comedy, one that isn't satirizing the film genre, but rather the business of martial arts instruction. The Foot Fist Way is the directorial debut of Jody Hill and stars Danny McBride as Fred Simmons, an egotistical taekwondo instructor whose overinflated sense of self-importance brings misery to himself and those around him. After he learns that his wife is cheating on him, his life begins to fall apart. In a bid to heal his ego, he embarks on a road trip with his friend Mike, played by Hill, and two of his students to a martial arts expo to visit his idol, Chuck the Truck Wallace, played by Ben Best. What follows is basically a series of episodic vignettes that satirize the insular, delusion-addled world that is the traditional martial arts community. I'm not gonna lie, this film was painful for me to sit through. However, this is more for personal reasons. I'm coming into this film with a bit of a bias, having done Taekwondo for 4 years when I was in college, training with a school affiliated with the United States Taekwondo Federation. Not to be confused with World Taekwondo, which manages Taekwondo for the Olympics. The terminology that is used in this film is ripped verbatim from the USTF guidebooks, the names of the forms, the creed, the explanations of the forms, all of it. Turns out it's because the director Jody Hill is, or at least at the time of his filming, was a black belt and an instructor with the Federation. Now, while the instructors I personally studied with were decent people who tried to rein in some of the more toxic aspects of the art, the Federation is rife with people like Fred Simmons, practitioners who think that because they've attained an instructor's rank, they can basically order people around. I've had the misfortune of dealing with some of these people face to face. The rigid etiquette, the long-winded lectures, the demands of loyalty, the abuse of power, the hero worship. This was my life for 4 long years. So, suffice it to say, I found the film to be somewhat triggering. Personal hangups aside, I didn't really warm up to this film. The humor is best described as cringe comedy, where the jokes are derived from how painfully awkward all of the scenarios are. I'm fine with the occasional moment of awkwardness, but when a whole film is hinged upon it and centers itself around an unlikable, flat protagonist, it leaves me constantly checking the clock to see how much longer the film is gonna go. What doesn't help is that our main character undergoes no real, meaningful changes over the course of the story. It's basically watching an asshole be an asshole for 90 minutes. While there is some humor to that, it's not really what I look for in a comedy. As for the action and martial arts on display, there isn't much here. To be fair, that should come as no surprise given the structure of the film. I mean, the martial arts combat is not really the point of it, but we do see a few impressive techniques by some of the supporting cast who were actual Taekwondo practitioners. But as for the scenes with McBride and Best, it's the usual, neither of them actually know how to fight, so we have to shake the camera and use close-ups to make it look more impressive. Sadly, it doesn't work, nor does it even really get realism points, since what we see here is pretty much at the level of what you see in a typical TV sitcom. Overall, this film is simultaneously all over the place, yet goes absolutely nowhere. It never really comes to its own or really has anything meaningful to say. It doesn't help that the final moments of the film just hastily wrap up all the plot threads with no real thought or care, and then devolves into a pointless montage as though they're trying to rip off the Karate Kid, followed by what I guess is supposed to be some sort of uplifting scene that ultimately added nothing. If you're into shows like The Office or Napoleon Dynamite, then you might enjoy this film for all its cringe and pseudo-mockumentary stylings, but for me, I just found it to be a frustrating experience that thinks a rough edge, cringy moments, and crude humor are enough to carry a story. However, Fred Simmons is no Michael Scott. Even its biting commentary on Taekwondo is just surface-level stuff. It's a real shame because if you wanted to make a film looking at the world of traditional martial arts and how they are taught, especially in the United States, there is a whole treasure trove of BS that could be mined for comedic gold. This film, however, took no such opportunities. They went to the trouble of adding the minutia from the USTF, but did nothing with some of the more egregious elements. However, considering that Hill, at least at the time of filming, was an instructor with the Federation, I can't say I blame him. However, this just leaves me wondering what the point of the film even was. After the bleak and sour taste I had in my mouth from my previous review, I wanted to look at something a little bit more uplifting. While this film is called Drunken Master 2 in most Asian territories, the film is not actually a sequel, but rather a soft reboot, to use modern nomenclature. This is why it was released under the title Legend of the Drunken Master here in the United States, instead of Drunken Master 2. You don't need to have seen the previous Drunken Master in order to follow this film, since there's no mention of Beggar So or any of the previous film's events. There are some references to the techniques, but those references are only in the original Hong Kong version. Speaking of which, unfortunately, I'm going off of a DVD of the US release put out by Dimension Films, which is dub only, and features a different musical score, different sound effects, and a few scene changes. At the very least, this came out at a point when Jackie had become a household name, so they at least brought him in to dub over his lines, so this makes it a little bit easier to tolerate. Chan reprises his role as Wong Fei-hung, the son of a martial arts instructor and doctor. While attempting to smuggle ginseng back to their village, Fei-hung accidentally stumbles upon a scheme by the British ambassador to smuggle ancient Chinese artifacts out of the country. This leads to numerous battles in which he unleashes his famous drunken boxing style on a myriad of opponents. However, in stark contrast to its predecessor, Drunken Master 2 has a very anti-alcohol message, as earlier fights in which Fei-hung relies on drunkenness to overcome his opponents only gets him into more and more trouble, until the second act where he's basically beaten and publicly shamed by some of the ambassador's goons. Another key point is that Fei-hung starts out as a punk who just fights for fun or fights because he's goaded into it by his enabling stepmother, but over the course of the story, he discovers a more noble cause to fight for and therefore becomes a better person. While I could go into some of the socio-political details about the story, Accented Cinema on YouTube has already broken that aspect down into greater detail, so I would advise watching his video discussing patriotism in Chinese cinema. Suffice it to say, even in this Americanized state, the themes of cultural pride in the face of exploitation by foreign powers rings through loud and clear. As for the action, this is Jackie in his prime, with masterful choreography and stunt work. Honestly, every single fight scene in this film is a masterclass on how to stage, block, and shoot an engaging action scene that also conveys character. This is seen most notably during a number of the fights in which Fei Hong problem solves mid-battle. As for the style of the choreography, it's a nice blend of the traditional Chinese opera-style choreography seen in Jackie's previous films, and some of the more modern action flourishes, resulting in the back and forth between fighters being a bit more fluid and quick, with a more subtle pace to its rhythm. Overall, this is a classic Jackie Chan film through and through, and fortunately, of all the films Dimension released as part of their little exclusivity deal, this one suffered the least amount of arbitrary edits and changes. However, in spite of those changes, it's still incredibly entertaining to watch. That said, I really hope we one day get an authentic release of the Hong Kong version here in the States, because the music they composed for the US version has no real soul to it. While it's not bad, it basically just makes use of stereotypical Asian-sounding flourishes, as though the audience watching the film is too stupid to remember that they are watching a film made and set in China. And aside from that, the original theme song is kick-ass, and the fact that it was left out is a crime in and of itself, especially considering that they replaced it with a very crappy generic rock track during the credits. I mean, come on. Here's hoping at the very least that this film gets the Criterion Collection treatment like we got with the first two police story films. Given the number of Choi Hark films I've reviewed for Martial March, I figured it was about time that I took a look at the film series he is the most well known for. While this isn't the first film series about Wong Fei Hung, Once Upon a Time in China is arguably one of the most well known. As such, I'm starting with the very first film in the series. Jet Li stars as Wong Fei Hung, a martial arts master and doctor who struggles to survive during a time in which the Western world has more or less infiltrated China, with various parts of the country having been divided amongst Western powers. Over the course of the story, he deals with various threats ranging from corrupt foreign officials, malicious gangs that intimidate the people of Hosan, as well as uncovering an underground slave trade where Chinese laborers are shipped off to the United States. The story is a little bit hard to summarize because the film follows a more episodic structure, much in the tradition of classic Chinese stories like Journey to the West or Outlaws of the Marsh, and later implemented by wuxia writers such as Jin Yong. As such, there are no clear act breaks, but rather a series of intersecting plot threads that all eventually converge in a final climactic battle. Despite being the main character, Fei Hong is a bit more flat here when compared to other Fei Hong films like Drunken Master, as this is a version of Fei Hong who has mastered himself. That said, this film is an example of a flat character done right, where his role in the story is to inspire change in the world around him, as we see with a number of his disciples and even minor characters throughout the film. While this does make the film feel a bit long in a few places, it's structured in a way where the numerous plot threads have smaller arcs to keep you going. It also helps that there are a great deal of engaging action scenes. Speaking of which, it's hard to single out any one action sequence in this film, as each one of them is a high-quality set piece. Hell, the film opens with one, as Fei Hong salvages a lion dance that is interrupted by French soldiers who mistake firecrackers for gunshots. Each scene makes use of the environment, which in and of itself is full of life. On top of that, we have the more modern action choreography that still adheres to its roots, with a subtle rhythm and back and forth between fighters, even in the more chaotic crowd scenes. What surprised me the most is that, in spite of the film being very much about Chinese pride, it has a surprisingly nuanced take on the Western world. It acknowledges that most of the Westerners came to China to make money, but it also shows that even among those Westerners, there are those who try to do the right thing. Overall, this film is a definite must-watch for anybody looking to study action filmmaking or even the wuxia film genre in general, since this film is what set the standard during the early 90s and 2000s. Fortunately, unlike Dimension Films, Columbia TriStar released the Once Upon a Time in China series unaltered. No rescores, no redubs, so you can view the film as it was intended. If you consider yourself a martial arts movie fan, you owe it to yourself to track this film down if you haven't already. From one famous mythologized master to another, we're taking a look at the film that kind of revived this genre for modern audiences. Since a number of online reviews have already discussed the film at length between the action and the narrative, I'm going to try to keep this one brief. Directed by Yip Wai-shun, Ip Man stars Donnie Yen as the eponymous martial arts master who is best known for having trained Bruce Lee. However, this film does not focus on him training Bruce, since the Lee estate wouldn't let the filmmakers use his likeness, so instead, they focus on Man's life before and during the Japanese occupation of China during World War II. The first 30 minutes of the film show the prosperous days where Fosan was known for its martial arts, with various masters challenging Ip Man to matches, much to the chagrin of his wife, played by Lin Xiong. However, this brightly colored life as a martial arts master comes crashing down down once the area is conquered by the Japanese Imperial Army, with Mon forced to take up hard labor to survive and provide for his family. When the Japanese army begins having the various masters fight for rice, Ip Man winds up on the radar of General Miura, played by Hiroyuki Ikeuchi, who wishes to test Ip Man's abilities for himself. Much like Once Upon a Time in China, the film follows an episodic storytelling structure, but the pacing is a bit tighter, to the point where the story could break down into the Western 3-act structure, with the Japanese occupation acting as the inciting incident, the battle against the 10 Black Belts marking the start of the 2nd act, and Miura's challenge to Ip Man marking the 3rd. Much like Wong Fei-hung, Ip Man in this film is shown as a flat character, the competent martial arts master who's the pinnacle of morality. At the same time, the film demonstrates how his example inspires others, changing the people and the world around him for the better, in spite of the oppression of the Japanese army. As for the action, while there is still a back-and-forth rhythm to the combat, it's much quicker than what its predecessors would usually present, opting for a more modern approach to action choreography. It works well for this film since Wing Chun is all about fast-paced strikes that wear down the opponent over time, as opposed to other styles that focus on heavier blows. Overall, it's easy to see why this film became as popular as it did. It takes a genre that was thought to be played out and gave it some much-needed life. Chances are, if you're listening to this, you've already seen it, but if you haven't, then you owe it to yourself to check it out so you can see what kind of jump-started the modern era of wuxia films. From Master to Disciple, we jump back to the 70s to take a look at Bruce Lee's 3rd film, which also marked his debut as a writer and director. Released as Return of the Dragon here in the States, Way of the Dragon stars Lee as Tang Long, a martial artist who travels to Rome to help Cheng Hua, played by Nora Miao, a distant relative whose family-owned restaurant is being shaken down by the mafia so they can buy the land the restaurant is built on. Now, for this review, I'm going off of the 2005 DVD released by 20th Century Fox, which is unfortunately dub-only and re-edited to capitalize on Bruce Lee's appeal in the wake of his death and in the wake of the release of Enter the Dragon, thus the name change. While Shout Factory did release the original version on Blu-ray, I've yet to track down a copy that doesn't require me to pay Jeff Bezos in order to obtain it, as it's no longer available through their website. None of the Bruce Lee films are, so I'm guessing they lost the rights. That said, this isn't nearly as bad as Champion of Death, because a majority of the original spirit manages to come through, to an extent. As it's presented here, the plot is pretty bare bones, very much in the vein of the multitudes of revenge and gangster films both Golden Harvest and Shaw Brothers cranked out on a regular basis. What hurts its presentation is the fact that the dub ignores the language barrier of the main character Tang Long, something that I know was a vital plot point. While it does try to find a way to cut around it and give a different explanation for certain scenes, it just makes it more confusing. The dub also tones down some of the more comedic fish-out-of-water elements the original story had in a bid to pass it off as a grittier action film. However, they at least left some of the action comedy that was present in the earlier fight scenes. Speaking of which, the action is pretty engaging to watch, even by today's standards. It opts for a more frenetic approach to combat, striving to be a little bit more realistic, while also allowing for flashy techniques. This is seen most notably during the 2nd act as Tang Long and the guys from the restaurant raid the mob boss's hideout in order to rescue Cheng Hua. Here, the fight turns into a messy, chaotic brawl that only wraps up once Tang Long decides to go all out. Aside from that though, most of the fights aren't too memorable now that I look back on it, save for one. The fight that launched a movie career, the epic final showdown between Tang Long and Colt, played by a then unknown Chuck Norris. Looking at this fight in isolation, it's almost like watching an experimental film, where Lee was still trying to find a sort of visual style for his fighting, something that he would attempt to build upon later for both Enter the Dragon and Game of Death. That said, as influential as this fight is, there's not a whole lot to say about it. It does have a fair amount of build-up as we see the two fighters warm up, and it kind of demonstrates this mutual respect, but once you actually get into the battle itself, the experimentation kind of lost me. I know I've been spoiled for modern action scenes, but I think this fight is a bit more hyped up than I feel it deserves, especially when you consider the kind of moments most filmmakers draw upon when referencing Bruce Lee. Now, I'm willing to chalk a lot of this up to the fact that this was his first time directing the film, because it definitely feels like it. Unfortunately, we never really got to see his style develop beyond this and what remains of Game of Death, but more on that in a separate review. Overall, this is still an entertaining action film. It's a standard Bruce Lee film, which is still a pretty high standard as far as action films go. Much like Champion of Death, there is a superior version out there, so I will likely revisit this film should I obtain a copy of the Blu-ray. Continuing this little journey, we're taking a look at a film about another heavily mythologized martial artist. On top of that, we're looking at the film that was marketed as the very last wushu film Jet Li ever starred in. Directed by Ronnie Yu, Fearless tells the story of Huo Yuanjia, played by Li, a martial arts master whose arrogance costs him his family, his school, and nearly his life. As he embarks on a painful path of redemption, he eventually goes on to inspire the Chinese people as he battles various fighters from around the world in order to prove that the Chinese are not the sick man of Asia. For the sake of this review, I'm looking at the unrated edition that was released on DVD, since the theatrical version toned down the violence and gore in order to get a PG-13 rating, whereas the unrated version is closer to the original cut. More on that later. Much like how Unforgiven was basically an anti-western wherein it challenged the viewer's preconceived notions about the genre, this film more or less does the same thing for the wushu genre. Firstly, it gives us a character that is essentially the antithesis of the typical wuxia hero, characters Li is mostly known for throughout his career. Unlike, say, Wang Feihong, Yuanjia is depicted as brash, arrogant, and prone to outbursts of violent anger, which brings about his fall from grace. This is established from the get-go with the action scenes. While it's the kind of action one tends to expect from a Jet Li film, it goes the extra mile in terms of characterizing him through his fighting style. This is seen most notably during Yuanjia's fight against Qin, played by Zhi Hui Chen. This fight starts out with weapons in the middle of the restaurant run by Yuanjia's best friend Jin Sun, played by Yong Dong. Over the course of the film, we see the location get absolutely demolished as the fighting techniques employed lose their finesse and devolve into savagery. If you ever wanted a cinematic example of a Pyrrhic victory, this is it. When compared to the final fight between Yuanjia and Tanaka, played by Shido Nakamura, which also starts with weapons, the movements are calmer, with a genuine respect being shown between the two combatants. Like the earlier fight, it also devolves into a breakdown, but this time, it's Yuanjia breaking down from the inside as he succumbs to poison. Another way this film subverts expectations is that it actually humanizes the foreign fighters that Yuanjia faces during the third act of the film. This is seen most notably with the character of Tanaka, but we also see this earlier in the film with his battle against Hercules O'Brien, played by Nathan Jones, a wrestler and strongman from the US who is framed as the one who coined the term sick man of the East. By the end of the fight, he actually treats Yuanjia with respect, and this is a far cry from the wuxia films of yore, where they more or less relied on cartoonish stereotypes. Now to address one of the larger issues with Fearless, the multiple versions. There are about 4 cuts in total, 3 of which are available here in the United States. You have the Hong Kong theatrical cut, the US theatrical cut, the Thailand cut, and the original director's cut. Unfortunately, the only copy I have is the unrated edition because I bought this long before the Blu-ray came out and wasn't even aware that the director's cut was even a thing until working on this review. The unrated version is basically the Hong Kong theatrical cut, but it has one big problem, particularly when you're watching the Region 1 US DVD release. Instead of subtitles that accurately reflect what the characters are saying, we're stuck with dub titles, where the subtitle track is just the script of the English dub. This irks me because when I saw this film in theaters when I was younger, there were a number of lines that had a real impact, and these dub titles effectively ruin them. The 2 biggest moments where this occurs are, coincidentally enough, the moments following Yuanjia's fight with Qin and his fight with Tanaka. With the original subtitles for the former, it's after Yuanjia learned that his family was killed by Qin's godson in retaliation for Yuanjia killing Qin, a fight that he instigated after Qin had beaten up one of his students. Said student reveals that Qin beat him up because he had insulted his wife and was defending her honor. The dub titles changed this to the student saying that he was beat up because he was sleeping with Qin's mistress. I'm not sure why they made this change, aside from the logic that Qin had to be made somehow as flawed as Yuanjia, even though that goes against the entire point of the film. In the case of the fight with Tanaka, this is seen most egregiously during Tanaka's exchange with the businessman Mita, played by Masato Harada, who helped orchestrate the competition and is framed in the film as the one behind Yuanjia's poisoning. Mita chastises Tanaka for declaring Yuanjia as the victor in their bout, saying something to the extent, "I don't know the exact line, but I kind of know the general meaning is, and you dare call yourself Japanese." This prompts Tanaka to pin him to the wall and respond basically by saying, "You are not Japanese." The dub titles replace this with a very generic back and forth between the two, with Tanaka asserting that Yuan-ja won the bout, robbing the film of what I feel is a really important piece of subtext for a film that is largely about having pride in one's national identity, something that was reinforced right down to the costume choices between the characters. Those gripes aside, this film is still enjoyable to watch. The action scenes are some of the best of Lee's career, and for a film that is effectively a final swan song, he went out on a high note. Fortunately, the director's cut is available on Blu-ray, so add this film to the ever-growing list of films I need to revisit once I actually get a hold of it. And now for something completely different. I first found out about this film by stumbling across the trailer on Welgo USA's YouTube page. The premise seemed simultaneously silly and awesome that I bought the DVD when it came out, only for it to sit on my shelf for a number of months until opening it specifically for this review. I was not prepared for what I saw. Directed by Jeffrey Lau, the premise seemed simple enough. Fei Yingxiong, played by Ashin Shu, is struggling to win over the woman of his dreams, Bao Er, played by Mei Dina. Seriously, that's her name in the credits. In his angst, he accidentally summons 4 legendary kung fu masters to modern day in order to learn martial arts and eventually win her heart. Those 4 masters are Wang Fei Hong, played by Vincent Zhao, Huo Yuan-ja, played by Andy On, Chen Zhen, played by Danny Chan, and Ip Man, played by Dennis To. While the premise seems simple, the film seems to have a bit of an identity crisis. While it makes it clear that this is a film that is not meant to be taken seriously, it's not sure about what kind of comedy it wants to be. It certainly doesn't help that it can't even get its own narrative mechanics straight, since it can't really decide on the mechanics behind the masters appearing. It first implies that they are being pulled from the pages of the comic book that Yingxiong is drawing, but then it establishes that they were pulled from the time period, implying that they are the masters themselves and not the characters from the comic. It's kind of confusing like that. Speaking of confusing, it kind of keeps alternating between trying to be an action comedy a la Jackie Chan or a parody film a la Stephen Chow. It definitely is one of those comedies where it's heavily reliant on the viewer being familiar with the films that they are referencing, very much in the fashion of the Scary Movie parody series. In fact, quite a few of the jokes are direct references to the films and the actors themselves, so some of the humor doesn't really translate. I also get the feeling that the filmmakers weren't fans of the Ip Man films, as Ip Man seems to be the butt of a number of the jokes. Things only get more confusing as we get to the final 30 minutes, where the film swerves into being a romantic comedy, and then to ripping off the plot of almost every fighting game ever made in history. As for the action, a lot of it is hit or miss, and a lot of it is reliant on CGI, usually for comedic effect. However, it's also caught in this weird in-between state between trying to be an action comedy and a parody when it comes to its execution. While it's a little bit more consistent in that regard, this results in the action itself not really being memorable for anything skill-related, but rather for its surrealist imagery, especially during the ending. Overall, this film is a decent comedy. I did laugh a few times while watching it, but there's not really much in this film to justify the full price that I paid, which was about $13 for the DVD. Since much of the humor relies on being familiar with classic martial arts movies and Chinese pop culture in general, the average viewer is really not going to get a lot of the jokes. While I had fun with it, it's probably not going to have much of a shelf life since a number of the jokes are also fairly dated. It's an okay film, but this isn't my go-to choice when recommending a kung fu comedy. Kung Fu Hustle, this is not. Since the previous film I looked at on the show used comic books for its premise, I figured I'd take a look at a few films that are, in turn, based on comics. And what better way to kick off this series of reviews than by taking a look at one that is based on a parody comic. Directed by Yuichi Fukuda and based on the Shonen Jump manga by Hideaki Sorachi, Gintama is set in an alternate version of Meiji-era Japan, where aliens force the country to open its borders to trade and colonization. After a violent rebellion was quelled, the new government outlawed all swords, with samurai falling into irrelevance. Navigating this strange new era are a lazy, hyperglycemic former samurai named Gintoki, played by Shun Oguri, the son from a disgraced samurai family named Shinpachi, played by Masaki Suda, and a super strong alien girl named Kaguda, played by Kana Hashimoto. The three of them run an odd jobs business, taking whatever job they can in order to scrape by. Hijinks ensue. That's honestly the best way I can describe the film. Much like the manga and anime adaptation, it makes it clear from the get-go that this is a film that is not meant to be taken seriously. It is rife with fourth wall breaks and numerous references to classic anime and Japanese pop culture. However, this is where we run into the film's biggest problem. The tone is all over the place, constantly switching between comedic and dramatic. While this is present in the source material, it had the benefit of multiple chapters and multiple TV episodes to pace the tone shifts out so it flowed more smoothly. As the this is a feature film, it doesn't really have that luxury, and this is most apparent when we look at the action scenes. While they are fairly well choreographed, particularly the fights between Gintoki and Nizo, played by Hirofumi Arai, they feel out of place. Some of the fight scenes, like some of Kaguda's antics, are played up for comedy and fit with the tone that's been established, whereas the aforementioned fights play things almost completely straight. Another major problem is that the audience is expected to be already familiar with the characters and the premise of the series, working in gags that only make sense if you've read the manga or seen the anime. Without that foreknowledge, it just feels like pointless fan service. As for me, I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who watched the anime a little bit back in its heyday, but lost track, so my familiarity is limited at best. As for the execution of the action scenes, they are fairly entertaining with a nice blend of practical effects and CGI, comparable to what you would see in shows like Garo or more recent seasons of Kamen Rider. That said, there are moments of shaky cam and quick cutting meant to make some parts of the fight look more exciting than they actually are, but at least that's kept to a minimum, and only really becomes an issue during the final battle of the film. Overall, I would say this film is best enjoyed by those who have already seen the anime, as it's constructed more as a live-action companion to the series than a standalone film. On top of that, the number of pop culture references they make only makes sense to die-hard otaku who are well-versed in anime and Japanese cinema, and even then, some of those references and non-sequiturs feel more like padding more than anything. The action is okay, but out of place due to the inconsistent tone, so if you like the anime series, you'll like this film, but if you've never heard of Gintama, then this film is not the best introduction to the series. You're better off watching the anime, which is available on Crunchyroll. Based on the long-running manga series by Tsukasa Hojo, City Hunter stars Jackie Chan as private investigator Ryo Saiba, who, along with his assistant Kaori, played by Joey Wang, yes, that's her credited name, are hired to track down the missing daughter of a Japanese newspaper magnate. Their investigation leads the two aboard the Fujimaru, a luxury cruise liner that is targeted by a terrorist group seeking to rob the rich passengers on board. Fortunately for this review, I managed to snag a region-free copy of the Hong Kong version, meaning I'm going off the original, unaltered version of the film. This is the same version that was available on DVD released by 20th Century Fox back in 2003, whereas more recent releases, particularly the ones by Shot Factory that is bundled with Battle Creek Crawl, are dub only. As for my familiarity with the source material, City Hunter never really got a foothold here in the States. By the time I had heard about the series, the company translating the manga had long since gone bankrupt, and the anime distributor that had licensed the anime had also dissolved, meaning the series had become really hard to find. That said, I do have some familiarity with the characters and the premise, as Crunchyroll hosts the live-action adaptation of the sequel/spin-off series Angel Heart. I mention this because right from the get-go, something seemed off about this film. It presents itself as a very sort of tongue-in-cheek parody, whereas City Hunter as a series, while it does have its fair share of comedic moments, from what I understood, is mostly a serious mystery series comparable to something like Lupin III. This film, on the other hand, is a comical farce from start to finish. While it has the characters from the series in the film, sort of, it feels like they were written with only a superficial understanding of who they are and what roles they play. It feels like they just didn't really understand or even really care about the source material and simply purchased the license just as a vehicle for Jackie Chan. It's a shame because in execution we could have gotten something pretty similar to Police Story, which balances the drama and the comedy fairly well. This would be tantamount to taking a series like Detective Conan, another lighthearted but mostly serious series, and giving it to the people behind Young Sheldon or The Big Bang Theory. It just wouldn't work. So it fails as an adaptation, but how does it hold up as a Jackie Chan film? Well, it's okay, but definitely not one of his best films. It's fast and loose with the physics behind the physical comedy to the point where it just loses consistency. In some scenes it relies on Looney Tunes style sight gags, but in others it tries to follow Jackie's usual formula. And while the fight scenes look good in isolation, when watching the film as a whole, it just feels like a whole lot of noise. Never would I have thought that I'd be checking the clock while watching a Jackie Chan fight scene to see just how much longer it was going to go on. As a whole, this film is tolerable, but sorely lacking in substance. It's more of a parody of the manga that it's adapting, and not even a well thought out parody. As a Jackie Chan film, it has that blend of action comedy he's known for, but it lacks that emotional heart that makes his film so endearing. Honestly, you're better off skipping this one. If you're a fan of Jackie, there's a whole library of better movies out there to watch, and if you're a City Hunter fan, there are a number of much better adaptations out there to watch as well. After the last film that I reviewed, I wanted to look at an adaptation that had a lot more passion and love behind it. Purportedly, this film was also made on a budget of only $400,000 over the course of 2 weeks, at least according to the film's director. Based on the Shonen Jump manga by Akira Miyashita, Be a Man Samurai School, or as it's known in Japan, Sakigake Otokojuku, is an ensemble film where a group of young men attend a strict private school named Otokojuku, which aims to make them into real manly men. The characters that are the primary focus here are spoiled rich kid Hidemaru Gokukoji, played by Hiroyuki Onoe, who is eager to run away from the school, martial arts enthusiast and eager freshman Ryuji Toramaru, played by Shintaro Yamada, the gentle giant Genji Togashi, played by Shoei, yes, he only goes by one name, who attends the school in honor of his older brother who perished prior to the start of the story, and lastly, the kind-hearted but enigmatic Momotaro Tsurugi, played by the film's director and screenwriter Tak Sakaguchi. Film, for the most part, is a series of vignettes that detail various hijinks and misadventures at the school, but it does have a through-line plot where an expelled student, Omito Date, played by Hideo Sakaki, seeks to conquer Otokojuku as revenge for his torturous punishments and subsequent expulsion from the school. Now, I say vignettes because there's no really other way to describe the story. It's comprised of a number of smaller plot threads that converge in the final hour of the film. While this would normally bother me, the film actually finds a way to make it work, largely due to the fact that the spotlight is shared amongst multiple protagonists. That said, it does feel like it takes a while to get going, especially since it starts with a more comedic tone. However, its humor isn't based in genre awareness or pop culture references, but rather how over-the-top the characters and the school itself are. The earnest performances of the cast definitely help with this, as it makes the world of the story that much more believable. As for the action, there's not too much I can say about it. While it does make use of a fair bit of trickery, it seems to be grounded in a sense of realism. They do take dramatic license where appropriate, particularly when using over-the-top special moves, but when not intentionally being grandiose, it has a nice gritty edge to it. If there was one word that could summarize this film, it definitely would be passion. As you can tell that everyone involved had a deep love for the source material. That passion bleeds into all of the film's facets, from the acting to the cinematography. As such, it makes the whole production feel larger than life. Not bad for what is ostensibly an independently funded fan film. While the film is a bit reliant on the audience having knowledge of the source material, as someone who walked into this blind, I didn't really feel that lost. This film does make me want to take a look at the manga and anime versions, but sadly they've yet to be licensed for distribution here in the United States. That said, if you like over-the-top action comedies with larger-than-life characters, consider giving this film a watch. It's currently available on DVD from Media Blaster's Tokyo Shock label, so it's not too hard to track down. Since the previous 2 years of Martial March have included at least one supernatural horror film, this review seemed almost inevitable. Mostly due to stumbling upon this film by happenstance at an FYE that was closing down. I'm more surprised that it's taken me this long to actually take a look at a film in the Shanbara genre, considering that the logo for Martial March features someone slashing with a katana. Based on the manga by the legendary Osamu Tezuka, Dororo tells the story of the wandering warrior Hyakimaru, played by Satoshi Sumabuki, whose body parts were sold to 48 demons by his father in exchange for power. With a demon-slaying blade embedded in his left arm, he travels the land hunting and killing each demon in order to reclaim each part of his body one by one. He is joined on his travels by a thief who disguises herself as a man, played by Ko Shibasaki, who takes on the name Dororo, one of the warrior's monikers, as they travel together. While that summary may sound like a spoiler, this is all information that is revealed within the first 30 minutes of the film. Now, for the sake of disclosure, I have not read the manga, nor have I seen either of the anime adaptations. That aside, while this film could be considered a Chambara film, it would also fall under the tokusatsu genre due to its heavy use of visual effects. Speaking of which, they do lack in polish, but I'm willing to forgive this film for that because it was released back in 2007 when CG was still kind of getting the kinks worked out. Since a great deal of the fight scenes are against demons, it's hard to comment on the action itself. However, the film does have its moments where the action choreography looks particularly impressive, and those are when Hyakimaru is fighting against human opponents. We see a number of throws and disarming techniques that are quick, really selling his superhuman reflexes. As for the story proper, it follows a more episodic structure, first detailing Hyakimaru's origins before showing us a fight against a demon that establishes the dynamic between he and Dororo. What then follows is a montage of the two fighting more demons as Hyakimaru slowly regains different parts of his body. Pacing-wise, the film feels a bit long in a few places, but it's enjoyable for the most part. Our leads have believable chemistry, and seeing them progress is fun. It's kind of like they wanted to do a live-action series based on Dororo, but had to condense everything down to one feature film. Overall, it's a fairly enjoyable film, particularly if you're a fan of Japanese folklore and supernatural horror films. The action has that sort of popcorn movie vibe where you watch it because it looks flashy and cool, much like kaiju or tokusatsu films. While I know it doesn't match up with the manga exactly, as someone unfamiliar with the series, I liked it. Let's continue our look at films based on comics as we take a look at a film that exemplifies the modern Chanbara genre as we know it. Based on the manga by Hiroaki Samura, Blade of the Immortal tells the story of the samurai Manji, played here by Takuya Kimura, who has been cursed with immortality after a particularly bloody battle. 50 years later, he crosses paths with Rin, played by Hana Sugisaki, the daughter of a head instructor of a kenjutsu school who seeks to avenge the murder of her parents by hunting down and killing Anotsu Kagehisa, played by Sota Fukushi, the head of the notorious Itoryu school who had been destroying dojos throughout Edo. Like my review of Dororo, I'm walking into this without any real familiarity with the source material. I haven't read the manga, nor have I seen either anime adaptation that has been produced. This review also marks the first time that I'm looking at a film by Takashi Miike, a man who has quite an extensive pedigree. Now, as someone who has not read the manga, if I had to describe the story of the film, I would say it's almost like a Chanbara version of True Grit, with Manji serving as the Rooster Cogburn to Rin's Maddie Ross. Like True Grit, the film explores the concept of vengeance and the endless cycle of violence that it tends to perpetuate. This is frequently reinforced as we see Manji fight various members of the Itoryu who, in their own way, have been exploited by the feudal system. As such, the film presents kind of a grayish sense of morality, where nothing is as clear-cut as it seems, with complex details and motivations muddying the waters. That said, there are times where the film does seem to drag a little bit, particularly during the final 30 minutes of the film, where we get a long, brutal battle between Manji and 300 people. While the battle itself is cool to watch, it kind of grinds the narrative to a halt, not helped by the fact that it is literally interrupted by a side villain for a smaller fight before we see a final face-off between Manji, Rin, and Kagehisa. As for the action, it's bloody and brutal, the kind of thing you usually expect to see in these kinds of films. We see a myriad of fighters wielding a myriad of weapons, with Manji's immortality allowing for some interesting choreography. While the film does make use of a number of close shots and quick cuts, the pace of the scenes flows smoothly as the film knows when to pull back and slow down to let the audience breathe. Overall, this is definitely a must-watch for fans of Chanbara films, and I would even recommend it to people looking to get into filmmaking, as there is a great deal of artistry on display in addition to the action. Hell, the opening scene of this film is worthy of study in and of itself. Fortunately, this film is readily available on most services, so tracking it down won't be too difficult. To cap off this series of reviews, where I took a look at martial arts movies based on comics, I wanted to take a look at one of these seminal Jidaigeki franchises. This is a series that has had a profound influence on both Japanese and Western media, an influence that we still see to this very day. Based on the manga by Kazuo Koike and Goseki Kojima, Lone Wolf and Cub: Sword of Vengeance tells the story of Ogami Ito, played by Tomisaburo Wakayama, an executioner for the Tokugawa shogunate who is accused of treason. Marked for death, he and his son Daigoro, played in this film by Akihiro Tomikawa, go on the lam as Ito pursues the people who framed him in a cursed journey of vengeance known as Meifumado, or The Road to Hell. For this review, I'm going off of the DVD that was released by the Criterion Collection in a box set with the other 5 films, meaning that I'm seeing this film in its intended form. On top of that, I actually have read Lone Wolf and Cub, at least the first omnibus of it, so I'm able to discuss whether or not the source material is faithfully represented, although that may be a bit of a moot point considering that the screenplay for this film was written by Koike himself. As I mentioned, this film is the first in a series of 6, and much like the manga, it jumps backwards and forwards in time, alternating between Ogami's backstory and the current assassination job that he's pursuing. For the most part, the film follows the plot of the manga's 8th chapter, which sees Ito and Daigoro traveling to a village known for its hot springs, only to find it taken over by bandits. Looking at the film and the manga side by side, it follows the beats pretty faithfully and even mimics the framing of some of the manga panels, with lines of dialogue being lifted verbatim. It definitely shows that Koike wrote the script himself, as it's mostly one-to-one, save for what elements that couldn't be translated from page to screen. That said, pacing-wise, it moves at a pretty brisk pace, as the first 2/3 of the film are dedicated to the murder of Ito's wife and the subsequent framing by Retsudo Yagyu, played by Tokio Oki. As a result, this leads to the film's ending kinda trailing off, which does keep to the style of the original manga, but may leave some viewers a bit dissatisfied. Throughout all of this, we're treated to fast-paced, gory action as Ito cuts down his foes with minimal effort. All of the tropes you can think of when thinking of Chanbara films are present here. The blood spurts, the quick draws, the super intense stare-downs, etc. It's easy to see why this film is regarded as one of the classics of the genre. Overall, you get exactly what you pay for with this film. Bloody, fast-paced action mixed with melodrama. Even if you've never read the manga, the film is pretty easy to follow, and even if you're a purist, you'll be happy with the faithful transition the story made from page to screen under the guidance of the original scribe who brought it to life. Luckily, since this film, along with its 5 sequels, were released by the Criterion Collection in a box set, it's really easy to track it down, and it's widely available on DVD and Blu-ray. And if you're someone who is studying filmmaking, I also recommend checking out this film. That way you can kind of understand the influence that it had on filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino and Genndy Tartakovsky. After looking at films based on comics, I felt it was appropriate to take a look at a few martial arts films that are based on novels. In this particular case, this is a film that I learned about because of a translated manhwa comic that was based on the same novel, so I initially thought that the comic was the basis for this film rather than the novel itself, but as I did my research I realized, oh, it was the novel that came first, so I'll still keep it in its place in line, it'll make for a nice segue. Based on the Wun Sui On novel series Si Da Mingbu, which roughly translates to The Four Constables, The Four is a wuxia film that combines action, mystery, and superhero genres. Set during the late Northern Song Dynasty, the story focuses on an investigation into counterfeit currency that turns into a power struggle between the well-organized Department 6, which has jurisdiction over the imperial capital, and the clandestine Divine Constabulary, which acts with the authority of the emperor himself. In the midst of this investigation, we follow Leng Ling-chi, played by Deng Chao, a lower-ranking constable who is publicly dismissed from Department 6, but then goes undercover as a member of the Divine Constabulary as a spy for the head of Department 6, Commander Liu, played by Tai Shen Cheng. Here, he encounters the other members of the Divine Constabulary who each have special abilities, with the main members being Kui Lui Shang, aka Life Snatcher, played by Ronald Cheng, a former debt collector who is an expert tracker, Tie Yorda, aka Iron Hands, played by Colin Cho, who's the group's blacksmith with immense strength and chi power, Shong Yayu, aka Emotionless, played by Yifei Liu, who has telepathy and telekinesis as well as her own form of chi power, and their leader Zhuge Zhenwo, played by Anthony Wong, who has powers of his own that are never quite explained or even addressed, even at the end of the film. If it sounds like I'm describing a superhero team, it's because I am. The film is more or less presented as a superhero film, very much in the style of early 2000s fare like the X-Men films, with a little bit of Batman and Robin thrown in for good measure. As a result, it suffers from a bit of a style clash, trying to present a traditional Chinese setting through a modern, hip lens, except with a very skewed definition of hip as defined by a group of out-of-touch film executives who think they know what hip is, but don't actually know what it is. The aesthetic also seems to pull very heavily from a lot of American superhero films like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and as a result, it just doesn't really gel well at all. As for the story proper, it's okay but kinda convoluted, much like a superhero plot where it starts with a simple case that becomes more and more complicated, thanks in large part to the machinations of the film's villain, An Shigeng, played by Zhu Bo Wu. It's moderately engaging if you treat the film like a cheesy popcorn film, and Wu's mannerisms as the villain play into that particularly well, even if he does seem like he's trying a little bit too hard to channel Loki. As for the action itself, it's cool for the most part. They do go a little overboard with some of the CGI flourishes, but at least there's some skillful choreography beneath it that helps sell the illusion. That said, there aren't really any particular fights that stand out to me since the whole film is kind of just a flashy, multicolor blur. That said, if you want a cheesy superhero film with a kung fu flourish and you happen to find it on Netflix or something, it's not the worst way to kill 2 hours. Just don't go into this film expecting high art. Continuing our look at martial arts films based on novels, today's offering brings us a more stylized wuxia epic. This also marks the second time I reviewed a film that I didn't realize was a remake until I actually started the review proper. This seems to be a trend with this show. Based on the novel Death Duel by Gu Long and directed by Derek Yee, who starred in the Shaw Brothers adaptation of the film back in the 70s, Swordmaster is an epic in the classic sense of the word. It's actually kind of hard to summarize the story without spoiling it, but I'll try my best, since going into this blind makes for an ideal viewing experience. The film follows two primary characters, the tattooed assassin Yen Shi-san, played by Peter Ho, and the drunkard with a mysterious past, Ah Chi, played by Kenny Lin. Shi-san is hired to assassinate the third master of Supreme Sword Manor by his jilted fiancée, Bu Young Chu-di, played by Yi Yan Jiang, only to find out that he's already dead. Having lost his only rival and later being told that he is dying from an incurable disease, he moves to a small village cemetery to wait for his death, no longer having a reason to live. At the same time, Achi wanders into the same village, racking up a massive bar tab at the local brothel, and later is put to work. A run-in with a pair of thugs runs the risk of revealing his dark past, so he attempts to run away, and is later taken in by a night soil farmer and his family who show him how to live a simple life free of shame and grief. Like I mentioned before, if I go into any more detail than that, I risk spoiling the story, as this is a film with a fair bit of mystery and intrigue with a number of surprises. It also features a wide array of interesting characters, each with their own quirks and motivations. I found myself quite enamored with the world of the story as well, since it exists in its own little fantasy world, rather than trying to anchor it to any specific event or timeline in Chinese history. As for the visual style, while the visual effects do lack polish in a few places, this film has almost a theatrical quality to it that allows you to suspend your disbelief. That said, there are a few moments where there are some gimmicks worked in, as this film was released in 3D during its theatrical run, and they really played up the fact that this was a first Chinese 3D movie, but those moments mainly appeared during the final moments of the film, whereas the rest of the movie, it's mostly absent. The action, likewise, is also augmented with CGI, but given the almost intentionally artificial look they're going for, it works in service to the story, almost like watching a live-action version of an action anime. What helps is the level of skill on part of the performers that serves as the groundwork for the fight scenes, as we see some impressive wire work and choreography, making what would have been a CGI crutch into a CGI flourish. Overall, this is a gorgeous looking film with a story that will pull you in. The performances are top notch, and the action is really exciting to watch. If you're looking for a martial arts film that has a little more story to its action, definitely check this one out if you happen to find a copy. This third film we're looking at continues along the thread of films based on novels, and since the previous film also focused on swordplay, this seemed to be the appropriate choice. Loosely adapted from the Liang Yusheng novel Qijian Xia Tianxian, or Seven Swordsmen from Mount Tian, Seven Swords comes to us from director Choi Hark. Seriously, given the amount of times his name has come up on this show, I might just have to do a full-on retrospective for him at this point. Set during the start of the Qing dynasty, the Manchu government has instituted a ban on the practice of martial arts in order to quell any and all rebellion. As a result, whole villages are put to death by the soldiers of General Fire Wind, played by Hong Lei-sun, and yes, that is the name listed in both the credits and the subtitles. After a particularly gruesome battle, a former government executioner named Fu Qingzhu, played by Lau Kar-lung, steals the plaques off the dead bodies, preventing the general from collecting any bounties, and flees into the mountains. Wounded by his pursuers, he ends up in Martial Village, a village where all of the residents practice martial arts, in case you couldn't tell. He attempts to warn the villagers, who ignore his warnings once his past is revealed, with the villagers dead set on executing him for his deeds as an executioner. In a bid to save his life, two young villagers, Wu Yuanying, played by Charlie Yeung, and Han Jibang, played by Yi Lu, sneak him out of the village under the cover of night. Under his guidance, they make the journey to Mount Tian, where they enlist the help of a number of sword masters, each with their own unique weapon. Upon returning to the village, the sword masters, with their swords in tow, repel an invasion by Firewind's forces, calling themselves the Seven Swords. While it sounds like I summarized the whole film, this all takes place within the first 40 minutes, as what follows is basically the characters' efforts to evacuate the villagers and elude Firewind. This film also tries to be an epic in the classical sense, but runs into the problem that films like Warcraft have, where there is just too much information that needs to be conveyed in too short a time. The first 40 minutes is action set piece after action set piece, with nothing really being established beyond the martial arts band. It felt like I was watching the film on fast forward, as there are events in this film's opening moments that feel like they belong at the final act of a different film. As a result, it takes a while before we even get a sense of who the main characters are, or even when we do, we don't get enough time to really understand or care about them. The film also tries to weave a number of subplots into the stories, resulting in the film feeling kind of bloated. As a result, I found myself getting bored while watching the film. It tried to have some strong emotional moments during the latter parts, but the beginning moves so quickly that I just didn't get invested. As for the action, the fight scenes range from cool to boring for many of the same reasons. We do see a variety of weapons and styles on display, but certain scenes were edited to include frame skips and blurry slow motion shots, as though they had to slow down the shots during the post-production process. The moments with those frame skips make it hard to follow the action, and as a result, the whole thing just feels like a visually chaotic mess. The only fight scene I really ended up liking was the final battle between Firewind and Chu Xiaonan, played by Donnie Yen, mostly because it's actually paced smoothly and shot in a way that allows you to actually appreciate the techniques on display. Overall, I would consider Seven Swords to be the Waterworld of wuxia films. It clearly had a large budget and a lot of man-hours put in, but the story is presented in a way that's mostly boring and hard to follow. By the time the film does slow down and let you breathe, you're too far into the story to really understand it. Considering that the original cut of the film was 4 hours long and that it was meant to kick off a franchise, this is a film that could have benefited from being split into 2 or more parts. I guess that's why Hark decided to try producing a TV series based on the same novel called Seven Swordsmen. While I haven't seen the series itself, television is probably a better avenue for this kind of story than feature films. As for Seven Swords, it has okay action scenes, but a boring, bloated story, so only check it out if you're mildly curious. With how boring the previous film was, I needed something to help recharge, so we're taking a look at yet another Jackie Chan film. Directed by Stanley Tong, the myth continues in the tradition of Jackie's Armor of God films, where Jackie is essentially playing a Chinese Indiana Jones. However, instead of playing a treasure hunter, he is instead playing an archaeologist named Jack, who has been having reoccurring dreams where he is a general in the Qin dynasty tasked with protecting a princess from Korea, Ok-Soo, played by Hee Seon Kim, who was set to become a concubine for the emperor. Jack is then asked by his friend William, played by Tony Leung, to come with him to a village in India to investigate a temple where the sarcophagus of a famous prince is said to be suspended in mid-air, the cause of which William wishes to unravel. Hijinks ensue in true Jackie fashion. Story-wise, the film alternates between past and present as Jack learns more about the nature of his dreams and what they might mean as more and more details become clear. Interspersed with this are a number of action scenes, some in the past, some in the present, that have that usual Chan style with both comedic and dramatic moments. As for the story as a whole, it starts out strong, but towards the ending it kind of fizzles out. It can't quite decide whether or not it wants to confirm that reincarnation is really a thing in the case of Jackie Chan's character or not. It also doesn't help that the film pulls some last-minute twists in an attempt to increase the stakes. On top of that, some characters just straight up disappear from the story. The action, on the other hand, is this film's biggest strength, as we get some really amazing fight scenes, some that have Jackie's classic comedic stylings. Honestly, those are pretty much the only reason you would want to watch this film. Aside from that, this film feels like a higher budget knockoff of the Armor of God films, and honestly, when compared to them, it looks kinda mediocre. The action is great, but the story is passable at best. This came out during a time where Jackie was active both in the United States and China, so this film feels kind of like filler, something to release or to work on between more ambitious projects. I mean, if you find it used and have 90 minutes to kill, you could do worse, but you could also do so much better. After spending a lot of time looking at films set in the distant past, I figured it was time to return stateside to shine the spotlight on some films set in more modern times. Granted, the 80s and 90s are no longer modern, but you get the idea. On top of that, this film allows me to talk a little bit about the Afro-Brazilian martial art capoeira, by looking at one of the few films where the capoeirista is actually the hero and not a one-off evil minion like in so many other martial arts films. Directed by Sheldon Lettich, Only the Strong stars Mark Dacascos as former Special Forces soldier Louis Stevens, who returns to Miami after serving a tour of duty in Brazil, where he had learned and mastered the dance-like martial art of capoeira. Upon seeing that his former high school has been overtaken by drugs and gangs, he endeavors to clean up the community by taking the school's worst students and training them in capoeira. Unfortunately, this draws the ire of the local drug lord Silverio, played by Paco Christian Prieto. Story-wise, this film is effectively Lean on Me or Stand and Deliver combined with the Karate Kid formula. Much like the Karate Kid, the interpersonal drama is what takes center stage, with the action taking a back seat. Over the course of the story, we slowly see Louis earn the trust of his students and turn them around, with the main holdout being Orlando, played by Richard Coca, who is Silverio's cousin, and is being groomed for a life of crime. This serves as the primary source of conflict between Louis and Silverio, where they battle over the soul of Orlando, and by extension, the soul of the Miami neighborhood. Action-wise, there are some fight scenes that look cool, even if they are a bit simplistic. Given the overall tone of the film, though, it works. One thing I especially like is that they make it clear that Louis is not invincible. He gets hit a fair number of times during his fights, and that helps to humanize him as a character. Another highlight is the capoeira techniques on display. They went the extra mile to consult Mestre Amen Santo, who trained Mark Dacascos and helped choreograph the capoeira scenes, which look amazing. Where things fall apart is during the third act, where the film tries to turn into a PG-13 low-budget knockoff of Rambo. What doesn't help is that some of the choreography in these moments are a bit nonsensical, as it essentially relies on Louis, a Special Forces soldier, to hold the idiot ball. On top of that, there are also some moments where the choreography is just lazy and uninspired, particularly the moments right before the final battle between Lewis and Silverio. Hell, even that final battle leaves a little bit to be desired, as it relies more on haphazard editing and odd camera choices, as though they didn't really have a lot to work with. The action almost devolves into a parody of itself, complete with a really generic musical swell when Lewis starts to turn the fight around, as though they assumed the audience would be too stupid to know who was winning. That said, I still found the film to be enjoyable. The story is well written and has a strong emotional core. While some elements haven't aged well, as its depiction of gangs is reminiscent of a poorly conceived after-school special from the 90s, I find that cheesiness is a part of its charm. It may be perpetually stuck in the shadows of the Karate Kid in terms of cultural impact, but at least it took a unique approach to the concept. Now, about that choreography, I know Mestre Amen handled the capoeira side of things, and that stuff looks really good, but I wonder who the main stunt coordinator was. Let's see. Oh, no. You've gotta be... I mean, God. Well, it was only a matter of time before I had to talk about this asshole. Now, let me get this out of the way right now. Frank Dukes is a fraud. His legacy of lies and quackery have been thoroughly documented, dissected, and debunked countless times by countless people in books, newspapers, and several YouTube videos. The most extensive video on the subject was one produced by the channel The Pink Man, but unfortunately he has since taken it down for reasons unknown. With that out of the way, we're going to be looking at this film as a piece of fiction, as opposed to a piece of fiction that someone claims absolutely totally happened, like for real guys. No, I didn't buy this trophy in LA, that was my body double. No, seriously, this really happened. Anyway, directed by Newt Arnold and written by Sheldon Lettich, Bloodsport tells the story of US Army Captain Frank Dukes, played by Jean-Claude Van Damme, who was trained in the art of ninjutsu as a child. He goes AWOL and travels to Hong Kong to compete in the Kumite, an underground full-contact fighting tournament featuring fighters from around the world and a variety of disciplines. Of course, by fighters from around the world, I mean a bunch of vaguely racist stereotypes. This film plays out like a low-budget knockoff of Enter the Dragon, as produced by someone with only a vague understanding of Asian culture, as we see a chaotic hodgepodge of Japanese, Chinese, and Korean iconography. It's as though they put a bunch of low-budget martial arts movies into a machine, and this is what came out. Of course, considering where the idea for this film came from, that probably should come as no surprise. On top of that, this film is so 80s, it hurts to watch. Between the cinematography and the music, it feels like a regurgitation of so many tropes from films like Rocky IV and The Karate Kid, complete with a montage that has an over-the-top song. I mean, the song literally has the chant, "Kumite, Kumite, Kumite." How the hell are we supposed to take this film seriously? On top of that, the dialogue is clunky and awkward, making it feel as though it were being dubbed by people who didn't really understand English and had to use badly dubbed kung fu movies as reference material. The music itself, aside from the aforementioned "Kumite, Kumite, Kumite" song, sounds like background music from a Sega Genesis game, which honestly explains a lot about the soundtrack to the first Mortal Kombat game now that I think about it. As for the fight choreography, yeesh. This film tries to make use of editing tricks for the most part, but the way certain movements are implemented feel as though they were designed by aliens who don't have an adequate understanding of human anatomy, nor the laws of Newtonian physics. While there are some standout moments, they don't really stand out because of skill or coolness, but for how weird and out of place they are. To be honest, this film just has to be seen to be believed. I've never seen a martial arts film so inept in its execution while simultaneously being so full of itself. If this film was showing on a TV in a sitcom or something, I would have assumed it was a parody of martial arts films as opposed to a legitimate production. I mean, overall, what can I say about it? It's a dumb and goofy martial arts movie you put on when you're looking for something to play a drinking game with. I mean, I can see why it attained its cult status, because, I mean, if you're looking for a badly produced, over-the-top martial arts film whose only redeeming quality is the eye candy that is Jean-Claude Van Damme, then this is the film for you. How could anyone see this movie and think, oh yeah, Frank Dukes, he's totally legit, I'm gonna pay him a bunch of money and train to be a super special ninja man? I mean, come on. Since the previous review was of a film based on the life of someone who claims to be a ninja, I figured we'd start taking a look at a few ninja films. A good place to start, at least in my opinion, would be a film that came out kind of at the start of the 80s ninja craze that also ended up inadvertently sabotaging a high-budget adaptation of the Eric Van Lustbader novel, The Ninja. Directed by Eric Carson, The Octagon tells the story of Scott James, played by Chuck Norris, a former professional fighter who tries to keep a low profile and put his past behind him. However, when a series of assassinations prove to be connected to his mysterious past, he endeavors to find the truth about who is behind the killings and confront his adopted brother Sekura, played by Tadashi Yamashita. Unfortunately, my copy of this film is on a DVD that was released back when DVDs were relatively new on the home video market. This was also a time before widescreen TVs were the norm, and long before publishers thought to include both widescreen and full screen formats with their releases, meaning I'm stuck watching this in a 4:3 aspect ratio with pan and scan, so take that for what it's worth. As for the film itself, the summary on both IMDb and the back of the DVD make this film sound a lot more exciting than it actually is. While we have some promise in the beginning with an opening showing the mysterious ninja training camp and the early assassination attempts and subsequent fight scenes, from there, the film just kind of devolves into a boring mystery involving competing mercenary groups intercut with various scenes at the training camp where the various recruits learn different ninja techniques. Those intercuts effectively rob the film of any real mystery since the audience is already told the answer. Now, it'd be one thing if the point of the film was to watch the main character figure things out, but they forgot to make that part engaging in any meaningful way. It's just a number of scenes with a bunch of dialogue alluding to things that happened off-screen that are somehow important to the story, but clearly not important enough to actually be shown. I get the feeling that people making this film secretly wanted to make a film noir, but were forced to make this film, or more than likely, were trying to rip off the Eric Van Lustbader novel, and so they tried to sneak in as many of the noir mystery ideas as they could. That would also explain the weird, breathy whisper that serves as Scott's internal monologue. The problem is that they put so much reverb that I wasn't able to understand what he was saying without having to use headphones. As for how the story plays out, it meanders with the dialogue scenes that basically serve as pointless expo dumps with the occasional fight scene thrown in, ultimately leading to a 20-minute action scene just to show you where the entire budget went. After that, the film just kinda stops. No resolution, no anything. The villain is killed and then it rolls credits. That's it. Looking at the action scenes, the choreography is very basic and uninspired. There are some interesting ideas in a few of the fight scenes in the middle, but for the most part, the fights in this film are very repetitive. Norris effectively makes use of the same basic spin kick combo with the occasional punch thrown in. As for the promised ninja content, you know, the stuff they put on the back of the DVD case, that all occurs in that last 20-minute action set piece, and even then, it's nothing really noteworthy. Most of the fighting during this segment is in a wide shot, with the fight taking place in the distance so you can't tell if the hits are actually connecting or not. I understand doing this once or twice for an establishing shot, but pretty much every fight is from these wide angles. Another problem is that you can tell in this film that Chuck Norris is not used to handling weapons. All of his movements when using swords and other weapons look really stiff, like he's afraid to commit to any of the movement lest the weapon flies out of his hands or lest he accidentally gores his partner. Overall, this is a film from Norris's early days as an action star, and it shows. In this film, it's as though he's not used to fighting for the camera. That detail aside, The Octagon is mostly a boring, bland action film that fails to tell its story in a way that's actually engaging. While there are some glimmers of a good idea here and there, it was either a lack of budget, a lack of thought, or a lack of faith that hinders the film's chances at greatness. If you're a fan of Chuck Norris and you haven't seen this film already, then I would say you aren't really missing too much if you skip this film in favor of some of his later films where he's gotten a little bit more comfortable being on camera. And if you're a fan of ninja films, this probably isn't one I would recommend, since the inclusion of ninjas feels more like an afterthought. If you were to replace the ninjas with any other kind of terrorist threat, the film would largely remain the same. Continuing our look at ninja films, we're taking a look at a film starring Sho Kosugi, an actor who is arguably the most well-known actor associated with the ninja. It was during the height of the ninja craze that he managed to carve out a niche for himself both in the States and in Japan. Directed by Gordon Hessler, Pray for Death stars Sho Kosugi as Akira Saito, a businessman who moves to the United States with his family to start a new life. Unfortunately, the building he bought to start a restaurant with his wife turns out to be a drop point for stolen goods. When a corrupt cop pockets a stolen necklace for himself, Akira's family is targeted by the local mob. A series of escalating incidents eventually force him to make use of his training as a ninja to exact revenge. For this review, I'm going off of the unrated version that was restored by Arrow Video for the Blu-ray release. The film had suffered through a number of edits when it was first released in order to get it down to an R rating, and as a result, at least with this particular release, it's easy to tell which parts of the film were originally cut out, as only the portions that were part of the R-rated cut had a higher quality transfer. That said, unlike a lot of unrated editions of other films, this is the original intended version of Pray for Death. In terms of the story, I would compare it to films like The Foreigner, where a seemingly mild-mannered man with a dark past is pushed to his breaking point, leading to an explosion of violence. The only difference here being that the main character is a trained martial arts expert, as opposed to a retired guerrilla fighter. The major commonality between the two films, though, is the layer of tragedy beneath all of the action. As a result, this film has a little more depth to it, since the emotional stakes are clearly established from the word go. What also struck me as fascinating was the attention to detail regarding the depiction of Japanese culture. While some liberties are taken for the sake of the intended American audience, you can tell they tried to be as respectful to the culture as best as they could, a far cry from films like Bloodsport or The Octagon. If there were some problems I had with the story, it would be the moments where one of Akira's children, Takeshi, played by Kosugi's real son Kane, is given fight scenes. Now, I can understand the first one at the karate dojo as a means of establishing his personality in comparison to Tomiya, played by Kosugi's other son Shane. And I can even forgive the second fight scene where kids tried to steal his bike, since that leads to Tomiya being kidnapped, which jumpstarts the plot. But he really didn't need that third fight scene during the final act of the film, where he makes use of a bunch of gadgets to outwit some of the mobsters. It just clashes with the overall tone of the film proper, and it felt like they just decided to splice in some scenes from a Home Alone knockoff into what is ostensibly a gritty revenge drama. Speaking of the fight scenes, this is around the time that action films in the 80s were finding their way, making use of some trickery, such as the use of stunt doubles and forced perspective camera tricks, while also mixing them with well-executed choreography by trained martial artists. Granted, most of the fights in this film are fairly one-sided, with Akira facing off against normal people, so that likely made some aspects of the choreography easier in some respects. As such, the action is actually really cool to watch. There's not much in the way of one-on-one fights in this film, but given that this is about a ninja getting revenge on the mob, you don't really need those, since most of the fun is just watching these guys get outwitted, outclassed, and then eventually slaughtered by a trained killer. Overall, I really liked this film. It strikes a nice balance between story and action by giving us a character with clear motivations and clear emotional stakes, something that a number of action films tend to forget. The action, likewise, is engaging and well choreographed and feels like an organic extension of the plot, for the most part. Fortunately, Arrow Video's release of the film presents it as it was originally intended, so tracking down this high-quality release shouldn't be too difficult. Released 2 years after Pray for Death, Rage of Honor once again pairs Sho Kosugi with director Gordon Hessler. However, it is not a sequel to Pray for Death as one might think based on what I just said. This time, Kosugi stars as a DEA agent, Shiro Tanaka, who uses his unique skill set to take down criminals. When his partner is killed during a drug bust, Shiro throws away his badge and embarks on a journey of revenge, leading him to Buenos Aires in pursuit of the drug lord Havelock, played by Louis Van Bergen. Looking at this film, it feels kind of like Sho Kosugi was trying to transition into a more Chuck Norris-styled role by playing a cop that happens to also be a martial artist. While the opening scene is engaging, he seemed kind of out of place. That said, story seems to take a backseat to the action in this film, and as a result, there's not as strong an emotional core this time around. However, that isn't necessarily a bad thing, as this film makes it clear that it is just a straightforward action film, much in the vein of films like Delta Force or Universal Soldier. The problem here is that it suffers from a bit of an identity crisis. It wants to pull away from being a ninja film in favor of being just a general action film, but then keeps changing its mind and working in ninja weaponry and stealth sections. This is especially applicable during the final act of the film, where they have evil ninja appear to battle Shiro. Story-wise, it's a bare-bones action film with a little bit of intrigue worked in. It's not a particularly deep or complicated film, nor does it really set out to be one. One major plus is that the tone is a lot more consistent throughout this film, unlike Pray for Death. Action-wise, the film delivers on what it advertises, with Sho Kosugi doing what he does best. If intense, high-octane ninja action is what you're after, you won't be disappointed. Like Pray for Death, this film is available on Blu-ray from Arrow Video with a high-definition restoration, so tracking down a copy should be relatively easy. Would I recommend Rage of Honor? Well, yes, but with the asterisk being that if you're a fan of 80s action films that are heavy on action but light on story. If you're looking for something with a bit more depth, you'll probably want to look elsewhere. And to cap off this little Ninja Mania marathon, I wanted to talk about a film that I have a bit of a soft spot for. The first time I saw this film, I was in high school and I happened to buy it on impulse for about $10 at a Walmart. I mention this because I might still have the nostalgia goggles on, but I'll try to give it as fair a review as I can. Based on the novel The Koga Ninja Scrolls by Futaro Yamada, Shinobi Heart Under Blade is set during the years following the Warring States period, where the nation has been unified under Ieyasu Tokugawa. The film tells the story of the feud between the Iga and Koga ninja clans, who are bound by a peace agreement that forbids them from fighting one another. During this time of peace, the heir of the Koga, Genosuke, played by Joe Odagiri, and the heir of the Iga, Oboro, played by Yukie Nakama, have fallen in love and secretly married one another. However, things change when Tokugawa breaks the peace agreement and orders the two clans to have their 5 best ninja face off in a duel to the death, bringing the two lovers together once again as enemies. This film is best described as Romeo and Juliet, but with ninjas, and while that may sound like a dumb idea, the film manages to execute it in a way that is engaging and has a surprising amount of depth. One of the central themes of the film discusses whether or not those who thrive in war have any place in society during a time of peace. This is demonstrated by the ninja that travel with both Genosuke and Oboro, frequently remarking about how they're living weapons whose only purpose is to fight, often choosing to die in the very bloody battles that follow rather than live without a purpose. The story is also a meditation on the conflict between choice and fate, with Genosuke fighting to shape his own destiny, while Oboro has more or less resigned herself to her fate as the leader of the Iga, a conflict that comes to a head by the film's end. When discussing the action, while there are some engaging fight scenes, some aspects of the film have not aged particularly well. This is due in large part to the fact that much of the action is augmented by CGI that opts for a more stylized approach as opposed to realism. As a result, the film looks like it's trying to be a live-action version of an anime, for better and for worse. Now, while I do have a soft spot for stylized effects, being a tokusatsu fan, I understand that that may put some people off. That said, I feel this film finds a nice balance between the CG effects and practical effects, leading to a film that has a unique look to it, even if it means the action scenes aren't too memorable as a result. Overall, upon revisiting this film, I still found it to be as enjoyable as when I watched it the first time. What it lacks in action, it makes up for in story, since the romantic tragedy is what takes center stage here. If you or your significant other both happen to be weebs, then this would be a film I would highly recommend for a date night, as the balance between action and romance will no doubt pull you in, and it might even leave you with a tear in your eye as you get to the ending of the film. Now, I know it may seem a bit strange to look at an animated film in a series about martial arts films, but given that this one focuses on martial arts, I figured it was worth a look. Well, that and I have no desire to discuss the live-action film from the 90s, so we're looking at this instead. Based on the Capcom fighting game that needs no introduction, Street Fighter II, the animated movie, comes to us from director Gisaburo Sugi and group TAC, best known for their work on the original space battleship Yamato. The film also features fight scenes choreographed by Kazuyoshi Ishii, who founded the K1 kickboxing league in Japan, and Andy Hug, who was a professional kickboxer. So, you can see my logic in why I chose to discuss this film. Now, when starting this review, I was going off of a DVD of the unrated cut that was released by Sony here in the States back in 1997. Despite the label of being unrated, it does feature some cuts and changes when compared to the original Japanese version. On top of that, since this was released at a time when the DVD format was new, this version is basically a copy of what was released on VHS, where it's dub only and features a westernized music track, which sadly was a very common thing with anime releases back then. Looking at you, Hayam. That's the risk when looking for anime DVDs on the cheap. Fortunately, Retro Crush has the original Japanese version available on their service for free, with ads, so I was able to watch the original Japanese version of the film as well. The only major difference I noticed editing-wise was the omission of literal TNA of Chun-Li in the lead-up to her fight with Vega. Pro tip, if you want access to the version with the original Japanese musical score, you'll have to watch it subbed if you're watching it on Retro Crush, as the dubbed version they have on their platform has the westernized music score that was present in the initial home video release. The story of the film loosely follows the events of the game. M. Bison seeks to conquer the world using cyborgs and brainwashed fighters, Guile and Chun-Li want to stop him and take down his organization, and Ken and Ryu get caught up in the middle of it all. The plot mostly exists as a means to string a number of fights between established characters together, and as a result, it's very bare bones. One thing to keep in mind when watching this film is that this film came out before a number of character details were set in stone in games like Street Fighter Alpha, so there are a few inconsistencies between this film and the canon lore of the games. That would explain why a character like Akuma would appear in one of the background shots with no acknowledgement of his presence in any of the following scenes. So the story is barely there, but what about the action? Well, firstly, the film is incredibly well animated, which allows the choreography to have some real weight to it. This is seen right from the start with Ryu's fight against Sagat. The only downside to the action is that it felt kind of held back by the need to work in the character's special moves. While some of the techniques are able to be worked in organically, as seen in the fight between Ryu and Fei Long, E-Honda vs. Dalsim, as well as the fight between Thunderhawk and Ken, other fights have these moments where the action is just stopped so the film can call attention to the technique being used, and this is seen chiefly in Chun-Li's fight with Vega as they try to work in her spinning bird kick. Those gripes aside, you still get some really cool looking action scenes with a fair bit of fan service to boot. Overall, even looking at both versions, I had a good time watching this film. If you're a fan of Street Fighter and just want an action anime with a simple plot and lots of action, then this would be a film I would definitely recommend. That said, between the dub and sub versions, specifically if you're wanting to watch this on a platform like Retro Crush, this is one of those cases where I would strongly recommend that you'd watch the film subbed with the original sound mixing and the original musical score. Fortunately, I know the Blu-ray release from Discotek has the option to pair the English dub with the original score, which would be the ideal way to watch the film so you can appreciate the animation, as the voice acting is actually pretty good for this dub. The main reason I stress this is because my main complaint with the westernized version is the westernized score. I found it to be rather grating. Particularly, I found the needless shoehorning in of songs by bands like Korn and Alice in Chains incredibly distracting. It was as if they were worked in without any real thought about how the music would reinforce, or more likely take away, from the film proper. Like I mentioned at the start of the review, it's available to stream on Retro Crush legally and for free. No, this review isn't sponsored, but hey, if anyone from Retro Crush is listening, call me. Following up my previous review, I wanted to look at what is arguably the most faithful live-action adaptation of Street Fighter to date. It goes to show that you don't need big celebrities and a multi-million-dollar budget if you have the drive and passion to bring a film to life. Originally produced as a web series, Street Fighter Assassin's Fist tells the story of Ken Masters, played by Christian Howard, and Ryu, played by Mike Mo, as they learn the techniques of Ansatsuken, or the Assassin's Fist, hence the title, under their master Goken, played by Akira Koyama. The fact that this was originally a web series does explain the episodic pacing. That said, as a feature film, it flows pretty smoothly as we weave between the story of Ken and Ryu's training with the story of Goken training alongside his brother Goki, played by Gaku Space, with the younger Goken being played by Shogen. The film works to establish a parallel between the two stories, with the temptation of the Satsui no Hado, or Surge of Murderous Intent, serving as the central theme. This is demonstrated by Ken attempting to use the Satsui no Hado to fast-track his training, and by Goki as he seeks to master it, much to the protest of his master Gotetsu, played by Togo Oigawa. As a result, the film places most of its emphasis on the emotional struggles of the characters. That said, there are a fair number of fight scenes as well, given the franchise we're dealing with. However, they have less to do with the techniques on display, and more with the emotions and the characterization in a given scene. One thing I did like was how they tried to make the theory and execution of the iconic moves into something a bit more grounded in reality, with the more fantastical elements of those movements being the payoff for when the characters actually master the techniques. It made that much easier to suspend my disbelief and showed a real attention to detail on part of the producers. Given that this was originally released as a series of shorter videos, it means that there are a number of standout fights, with each one building upon the last. As a result, it's hard for me to pick a favorite, particularly when you consider how interwoven the fights are with the narrative. Overall, this still stands as probably one of the best adaptations of Street Fighter that has ever been produced to date. I haven't seen the follow-up series they did that ties into Street Fighter V, Street Fighter Resurrection, but looking at this and looking at how much passion is involved, I hope we eventually get to see the World Warrior series they've been hoping to produce, so that way the events of the main game can finally be faithfully brought to life. If you're a fan of Street Fighter and have been longing for a faithful live-action adaptation, this is it. It's currently available on DVD through Giant Ape, which is a subsidiary of Funimation. Now, before you all start commenting and emailing me, boxing is just as much a martial art as any other. And what is Rocky about? Boxing. Ergo, it counts. For those of you unfamiliar with the film, Rocky tells the story of Rocky Balboa, played by Sylvester Stallone, a small-time boxer eking out a living by fighting in small clubs and working as a collector for a loan shark in the city of Philadelphia. Things change when, almost out of the blue, heavyweight champion Apollo Creed, played by Carl Weathers, picks Rocky to be his next opponent as part of a publicity stunt. Now, this film is a drama first and foremost, so it's a bit of a slow boil as we first see Rocky fight in a small club, where he's shown to be capable, if a bit sloppy and overly aggressive. As a result, nobody really takes him seriously, both in and out of the ring. Once his fight with Apollo is announced, his life almost does a total 180 as people who had previously disregarded him come out of the woodwork to ride on his coattails. Some offer him genuine help, such as the loan shark Gatso, played by Joe Spinell, giving him money to fund his training, while others, like Polly, played by Burt Young, and Mick, played by Burgess Meredith, try to capitalize on his newfound fame for their own ends. I'll be honest, there are some aspects of the story that have not aged well, given the current cultural zeitgeist. Case in point, Rocky's quote-unquote date with Adrian, played by Talia Shire. It starts out effectively by force due to Polly throwing a tantrum and ends in Rocky's apartment. The whole sequence felt kind of awkward and there wasn't really any believable chemistry in this scene. Honestly, it just gave me an uncomfortable feeling as it relies on some pretty outdated understandings of romance. I mean, the characters do show more chemistry when they are actually in the relationship, it just bugs me that what led to it was something that felt more creepy than romantic. As for the action, which in this case constitutes the boxing matches and the training montages to a certain extent, it's the film that pretty much created the formula of the training montage leading up to the big fight. It tries to keep itself moderately grounded in reality, but there are some training methods that are a bit questionable. As for the main fight between Apollo and Rocky, it's like watching an actual boxing match where we see the give and take. In contrast to the opening fight where Rocky's more aggressive, here he kinda hangs back in the first round, waiting for an opening and timing his hits, resulting in some surprising knockdowns in the first round. Then as the match goes on, we see both Apollo and Rocky slowly break down as the fatigue sets in. Apollo goes from treating the fight like a performance to taking it seriously, whereas Rocky isn't really fighting to win, but just trying to stay standing by the end of each round, and this is communicated effectively through their movements. Overall, it's easy to see why this fight is regarded as a classic and continues to be both referenced and spoofed to this day. Like I said, there are some questionable elements that haven't aged particularly well, and others that also give the wrong impression about what works when training for a boxing match, but that aside, it's still an incredible film that manages to hold up for the most part. Even if you don't have an interest in boxing as a sport, it's worth watching just to see what inspired a number of movies that followed its formula to the letter. And with that is it for Martial March of 2020. It has been a long, arduous journey, but now that we've reached the top of the mountain, we're all better for the experience. Jokes aside, if you're watching at this point and have seen this all the way through, I genuinely appreciate your support. Unfortunately, since I'm implementing the Jim Sterling method, or as he likes to call it, the copyright deadlock, it means I won't be making any money off of this video, so if you like content like this, consider supporting me on Patreon. You can find the link down in the description. But for now, dear viewer, it's time for us to bow out.